Look closely at any physical process: water freezing into ice, wood burning to ash, or rock slowly giving way to sand. The defining characteristic of the material world is constant, relentless change. Aristotle built a rigorous, logically precise framework designed to prove that the everyday mechanics of a freezing droplet are tethered directly to the edge of the cosmos. He set out the conceptual apparatus for this entire unified enterprise in his foundational treatise, The Physics. Here, Aristotle defines nature as an inner principle of change and rest. This internal drive is sufficient to explain an entity's behavior as long as no external force preempts it. To explain this internal drive, Aristotle proposes that all physical entities are hylomorphic composites, a union of matter, the raw potential, and form, the specific configuration it takes. This relationship operates by hypothetical necessity. A specific form demands specific matter. If the intended form is a house, it requires solid bricks. Liquid water simply lacks the necessary potential to lock that specific form into place. Because the universe is constructed of these matter-form composites, every physical change we observe is bound by predictable internal rules. In Aristotle's ontology, motion occupies a highly specialized transitional state. This state must satisfy the principle of non-contradiction. An object cannot possess mutually exclusive properties at the same time. A piece of iron cannot be simultaneously actually hot and potentially hot. To solve this, Aristotle defines motion as the incomplete actuality of a potentiality, precisely insofar as it is potential. Think of a house under construction. The process of building is the realization of those buildable materials exactly while they are still just materials in transit. Once the target end state is reached and the house is finished, the potentiality for building is destroyed, and the motion instantly ceases. Motion is the precise ontological mechanic required to change an entity's state from potential to actual without violating the laws of logic. For this transition to occur, two elements must interact. Motion requires a matching pair, an active potentiality in the mover and a passive potentiality in the object being moved. Even though two separate entities are involved, the process of change is a single unified event, occurring entirely within the target object. This interaction is governed by the principle of causational synonymy. The active agent must already possess the exact form it is transmitting. Aristotle's primary example is biological. Only a human who is already actual can generate a human who is currently potential. This rule holds in artificial production, like a builder constructing a house. The house's form originates in the mind of the craftsman. It is transmitted down a chain of intermediate tools until finally imposed upon the bricks. Physical change is a regulated process of information transmission, where form is copied from a fully actualized source. Of all types of change, locomotion, the change of place, is the most fundamental. Because interaction requires physical contact, something must move through space to bridge the gap between mover and moved. Locomotion is unique because it alters an object's location without changing its fundamental substance. We see this natural movement constantly. Heavy elements sink toward the center of the earth, while light elements rise into the atmosphere. Left to itself, this finite system would quickly exhaust its potential. All elements would settle into stagnant concentric layers, and all motion would stop. To prevent this stasis, Aristotle argues in On the Heavens that sublunar generation requires constant excitation from the eternal revolutions of the celestial spheres. The sun's movement along the ecliptic acts as the primary efficient cause, generating heat and driving the cycle of the seasons. Every localized causal chain on Earth is mechanically tethered to the continuous revolutions of the cosmos. This brings us to a universal rule presented in Book 8 of the Physics. Every single motion, without exception, requires a mover. This applies even to natural motions. When heavy elements fall, their mover is either the entity that originally generated them or the agent that removed the obstacle in their path. If we apply this universal rule to the massive, eternal celestial spheres rotating above the Earth, we encounter a logical requirement. These celestial bodies are ungenerated and eternal. They cannot be moved by prior physical generators like earthly objects are. Assigning a physical mover to these spheres creates an infinite regress. Each physical mover would require its own mover, stretching back into an impossible chain. If any part of this chain were a finite duration, the entire eternal sequence would be contingent and vulnerable to collapse. The physical cosmos is causally open. It lacks the internal architecture to independently uphold its own eternal motion. To prevent the regress, Aristotle deduces that the entity responsible for these eternal motions must continuously impart movement while remaining completely unmoved itself. Because it is unmoved, this entity cannot possess any potentiality. Potentiality implies the capacity to change, which is absent here. The unmoved mover is an entity of absolute, pure actuality, possessing infinite power to sustain eternal motion. Because it possesses zero potentiality, it must be entirely devoid of matter. It is indivisible, unextended, and exists beyond physical space. At this point, the science of physics becomes intrinsically incomplete, without a higher discipline. Aristotle classifies physics as second philosophy. The physical world is dependent on supraphysical entities that require an entirely different level of metaphysical analysis. Aristotle's physics is a rigorous journey that proves a final point. The mechanics of the material world can only be fully understood by looking entirely beyond it.